without evidence. Without evidence. There is no evidence. That's what we're going to discuss today, the lack of evidence, and who has evidence and who doesn't, and what is evidence. I don't know if we're going to get into all that exactly, but it's going to be the theme, because I happened to pick up a paper today, and there's a very common phrase that I will see in multiple articles about any political disagreement, and if it's the Republicans claiming that something is a foul, the automatic thing that you tack on there is just to say without evidence. So we'll explore that here. I'll start with this one. Election causes disconnect. Several times this month, Republican election officials in Colorado, along with leaders of the state Republican Party, have hailed the state's election system, drawing passionate rebukes from party loyalists and conservative activists convinced of widespread election fraud, despite a lack of evidence. The result is an intra-party rift, blah, 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 blah. The 2020 election is the first Ray Langston, chairman of the Montrose County Republican Party, has not trusted. And it says his concerns spelled out in a one-page statement to the canvassing board were fourfold: that Dominion voting software can be manipulated. The county and the company and county clerks say that isn't true. So I don't know. I've heard some things about the software being manipulated and certain financial interests leaning towards Democrats around that. I don't think that's a smoking gun necessarily, but perhaps should be investigated. And then just stopping the conversation at the company, who is completely impartial, says it's not true. Okay, well, I don't know if that's enough for me. The second point, that Secretary of State Gina Griswold, a Democrat, is too partisan. I don't know anything about those accusations. The third, that President-elect Joe Biden is possibly guilty of treason because of his son's overseas dealings. Yeah, that's been completely not discussed at all. Dealings with both China and Ukraine, which were very sketchy. But we can't talk about that because there's no evidence, because the media hasn't talked about it, and therefore it doesn't exist. And then the third one, and that the media is biased. Well, I think we all know about that. I thought it was interesting. I was listening to NPR several weeks ago, and there was like some kind of House committee, and they had the leaders of big tech there testifying about bias, and basically the systematic shutting down and censoring of conservatives on social media. And when I was listening to NPR broaching the story, they said, yes, they're basically claiming without evidence that this is happening. And let's go to our reporting. Now, keep in mind, they had actually the decency to say this: NPR gets funding from all of those big tech firms. And then they go into their coverage, and nobody's eyes glazed over while they were sitting in their car being told about how they had no evidence of what they were talking about, and there's no evidence of people being shut down or being able to talk about any issues in this country. And it tends to go one way, and we're supposed to take it from this authoritative news source that gets funding from the people defending themselves from the accusation of conservatives. And that doesn't at all color the way that they're going to do coverage on this. I mean, I would say how dumb do they think we are, but I don't think it's necessarily a matter of intelligence. It's just you want to see the world in a certain way, and you can get so desperate that you will be willfully deluded. And I think that's one of these circumstances. Now we have another one. I'm not getting into the individual topics of these. I'm just showing you the whole without evidence, and how casually that's put out there to people who are willfully deluded and who are choosing not to see things in one stance. So Trump suggests China to blame. In the first comments on the security breach, President scoffs at focus on Russia. Contradicting his Secretary of State and other top officials, President Donald Trump on Saturday suggested, without evidence, that China, not Russia, may be behind the cyber espionage operation against the United States and tried to minimize its impact. In his first comments on the breach, Trump scoffed at the focus on the Kremlin and downplayed the intrusions, which the nation's cybersecurity agency has warned pose a grave risk to government and private networks. The quote, "The cyber hack, all caps, is far greater in the fake news media, also all caps, than in actuality. I've been fully briefed and everything is well under control," Trump tweeted. He also claimed the media are petrified of discussing the possibility that it may be China. It may. There is no evidence to suggest that is the case. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said late Friday that Russia was pretty clearly behind the operation against the United States. Now, I went through and read the rest of that article, and there was no evidence presented about anything. So they didn't really clarify the picture. They just said, without evidence, it's claimed that it might have been China. But we definitely know that it's Russia because this guy from the Trump administration said so. And isn't it funny that they're contradicting each other? He, tee, he. And it was very amateurish. And it didn't really make anything clear to me as a reader because it's just drama that's supposed to, like, presuming that, I'm buying the Denver Post, I already slant a certain way and I'm just expecting that kind of narrative, and God forbid I'm actually informed about something on this issue because, reading it, I didn't really learn anything about it, and I already don't know much about it. I knew there was a cyber attack. I didn't know exactly where it came from, but now they're saying it's Russia, and it's always Russia. And it's funny about all these accusations about things coming from Russia because I feel like we did, 3 years of investigation around this, and there was no evidence, without evidence. So that still limps and lingers on, and there's just this gall to be like, oh, well, without evidence, they are contradicting the narrative. And it's like, you're just speaking power to truth. You're just speaking power to truth because you have all the microphones and you have people who want to preserve their worldview and they don't want to be challenged, and they are willing to censor other people or at least sit by while their fellow citizens are censored and just go, oh, well, they're not being censored. There's no evidence of that. And I really became aware of this. Well, I kind of knew it already, but it was really solidified for me with the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, where he was accused of sexual misconduct, and everybody knew who was guilty and who was innocent because, one was a man and one was a woman and one was a Democrat and the other one was a Republican, and one was a bad person, the other was a good person and a victim. And that's all you need to know. And if you insist on seeing the world that way, just know, I don't understand how you can be comfortable with that and then wax sanctimonious about basically anything. I don't know. It freaks me out a little bit. But the other thing that I thought was very interesting is, one, just seeing commentators on YouTube, because I don't watch mainstream media. I watch a lot of people on YouTube. And how they are being forced to tiptoe around very arbitrary rules about how they are allowed to discuss things, and the ice is very thin and you have to step on eggshells to just discuss anything of import, because if you just don't agree with the corporate media, I don't know, just to progressives out there, supposing you were listening, global capitalism and corporations are so evil, but you are very deferential to their narrative. You're very deferential to Big Pharma and the CDC. You're very deferential to Big Tech and the narratives that they put out. And I think it should alarm you that people aren't allowed, I don't know. I hear a lot of communist, socialist type rhetoric that I think is dishonest and harmful to the country. But if there was some kind of conservative majority that was saying we need to ban this and people shouldn't be allowed in any avenue to discuss critical race theory, we need to silence people, I would be up to your defense, because they don't have the authority to do that. Even if what I think you're talking about and doing is hateful, I have something called principles where I would say, you know, even if I think it's dumb, I don't think you should be censored. Even though I think what you're doing is dangerous, I don't think you should be censored. But there's no reciprocation for that. Where, you know, if you're an anti-vaxxer and if you think there was something fishy about the election, and if you saw that video in Georgia where they had those ballots underneath the table and people were rushed out of the room, and then they came back in and they're like, oh, well, that's no evidence. And it's just like, well, I don't know exactly what I saw, but I think we should, at the very least, be able to discuss it. But no, instead there's speaking power to truth and there's suppression. And regardless of what your political leanings are, I think if you have quote-unquote American values, you should not be advocating for the suppression of other people because they're bad people or they're anti-vaxxers. You just get to attach some kind of label to the person who's disagreeing with you, and then they become a non-person, and then you can just politically and physically will over them, whether it's the virus, whether it's the political situation, any of it. I mean, it's all politics now. There's no separation, but I don't know. Just be aware of that. Be aware of what you are giving up here and how you're conducting yourself. Because I find it very alarming that I just hear people on YouTube trying to discuss this, and they are actively being suppressed. And you can just sit in the car and listen to NPR and be like, oh, well, there's no evidence for that. But by the way, we take our money from these companies that are under scrutiny. And there's absolutely no conflict of interest there. It's like, oh, please. Come on. Wise up. So I guess that's a little short PSA about without evidence.